It's kind of hard to explain the appeal of pro wrestling to someone who isn't either a 12-year-old boy or a dork. But basically, it's like Black Ink Crew, but with the added intrigue of knowing that at some point, somebody's probably going to get put through a table. So, yeah, it's basically Love and Hip Hop, is what I'm saying. It's pretty much a soap opera on steroids. And if this were the 80s, that statement would be a lot more literal than what I intended, but whatever. And just like your grandma's stories, it goes on in perpetuity. It's the song that never ends, the never ending story, the giving tree that keeps on giving if all it knew how to give were chair shots and opioid addicts, which sounds a lot like my 7th birthday party, to be honest. I've said this in the past, but for y'all that don't already know, I'm pretty much just a theater kid stuck in a jock's body, or at least I was until I caught a case of marriage and parenthood. So what I'm saying is the combination of sport and spectacle that is pro wrestling is exactly the kind of intersection that somebody like me would absolutely swoon for. And I did. Well, a lot of times. I did. See, my love for pro wrestling is a lot like your first real romantic relationship, ebbing and flowing between downright manic obsession at the start to convincing myself that I was too cool to be caught even acknowledging its existence, to falling back in love with it when I realized that it was tailor-made for a dork like myself, to eventually just losing interest for it for no reason than stagnation, to eventually circling back once we'd both been around the block enough times to grow into the best version of ourselves to that point, until I eventually lose interest once more at some point a year or two from now, and the cycle continues. Yeah. What I want to talk about today, though, is that latter part. In a day in which kayfabe is deader than mainstream music, how do these performers continuously find ways to get us, the watcher, to suspend disbelief and invest in the story being told? So what does any of this have to do with anything in the title or the thumb of this video?
Let me tell you something. 30 years ago, we would have been strung up, getting hung for beating 2 white boys the way we just did. You might want to come out here and put some belts on us, but the only belts we gonna be wearing is a tag team belt. Let me tell you something. I don't like being up here. Nothing but rednecks up here. Nothing but geeks up here. Coal miners up here. Chicken farmers. Klansmen. I don't like nobody but my partner.
Now, say what you will about Jack as a wrestler or just as a human being. No, like, seriously, you say whatever you want. I'm not going to check you on that. But if there's one thing that the man knew how to do aside from commit attempted murder, obviously, is draw heat. Those of y'all who watched that Dark Side of the Ring episode already know what I'm talking about. And those of y'all who didn't, just go watch some of his promos from Smoky Mountain, or just tune in to the next couple of seconds.
I'd like to send a special shout out to my homeboy, O.J. Simpson. Keep up the good work, baby. 2 less we got to worry about.
It's the conviction with which he says it that makes it so compelling. You can feel the contempt he has for white folks in every word he's saying, and how much he revels in making the audience hate him for not knowing his place. Which, I mean, let's be real, it was probably in a prison somewhere, but again, that's aside from the point. Ron Killings, aka K-Quick, aka R-Truth, aka Daywalker, had, in my opinion, the best run of his career as NWA champion. Reason being, everything he was saying about being held back in the business by his blackness was not only genuine, but it had a kernel of truth to it.
You all know me from the World Wrestling Federation.
History lesson from the truth.
All right, try this on for size. I was told, the truth was told by a senior official that I could not make the same mistakes that everybody else makes. Why? Because I am a black man in a white man's world. Now, how does that shit take you?
Shoot a man.
about it yourself. If somebody said that to you or to one of your children, how would it make you feel? I am a black man in a man's world. So from this point forward, you take a good look at me. I am a damn legend.
Again, I'm not going to get into the history of racism in the wrestling biz, but just remember, this is practically speaking Hollywood as run by Carney. So yeah, you could imagine. My point being, in an industry that relies on the audience buying into what they're seeing, you have two options to get your audience to buy in my opinion. Let your audience in on the work, or lean into the real life tensions that the audience is already aware of. Like, Jesus, it's just embarrassing the amount of money these dudes left on the table because they think that it's high school or something. That's what made the Summer of Punk so effective for all of like 3 weeks. That's what made Bryan's run to WrestleMania 30 so as well. And what made Muhammad Hassan the greatest heel the company had in 20 years until Vince completely lost the plot. Same thing with Retribution, a very obvious and blatant Antifa ripoff. The problem is when you have a 70-year-old white man with a toddler sense of humor, you get Retribution. It's also why when the New Day first came together, I was worried, to say the least.
It's a new day. Yes, it is.
Yeah, y'all may not remember this, but the first promo that Kofi and crew cut together was basically the wrestling equivalent of the Very Smart Brothers blog. White male benefactor and all. Then they became Baptist preachers somehow. Now, I'm going to keep it a buck with y'all. When I first saw the promos, I was convinced that this was going to be played as a joke because, I mean...
Y'all feel it? You feel it, don't you? Feel the power of the new day.
But, I mean, this is the same promotion that gave us Crime Time and Kai En Tai. So, I mean... I give the Fed way too much credit is what I'm trying to say. But then the New Day started doing exactly what I thought they would from jump. And they played into the obnoxiousness of their gimmick. The former Devon Dudley had a modicum of success doing something similar years earlier, but instead of playing it for jokes, he played it for jeers. He was a hypocrite of the highest order and an unrepentant one at that. Matter of fact, if I could go back to Truth for a minute, his conspiracy theorist gimmick was in a lot of ways just an extension of his early TNA run. The whole point was that there were forces behind the scenes keeping the glass ceiling above his head from shattering no matter how hard he hit his head up against it. It's too bad that they made him jump the shark with the whole Robert E. Lee bit because that character was worthy of at least a transitional champion run, if you ask me. Again, when you look past the outrageousness of the gimmick, there is elements of truth in what Truth was saying. Again, I'm not doing the history of black wrestlers thing here, but between the backstage politics, the cliques backstage, and of course the systemic racism, Truth had a solid enough argument that his relegation to upper mid-card hell was not entirely or even mostly his own fault. The New Day got over due largely in part to their in-ring ability, but also because they managed to do what Vince hadn't since we learned it was him all along.
It's me, Austin! Oh, son of a bitch! What?
Again, if it hadn't already, kayfabe had basically died by this point with the steroid trial. And if not then it died in Montreal. And if not then with the interview after Montreal. And if not there, then during that time when Vince literally went on air and told us all that wrestling was fake.
Even though we call ourselves sports entertainment because of the athleticism involved, the key word in that phrase is entertainment. We borrow from such program niches like soap operas, music videos, Jerry Springer, cartoons like the King of the Hill on Fox. We in the WWF think that you, the audience, are quite frankly tired of having your intelligence insulted.
You see where I'm going with this, right? And if Vince didn't do it, then the internet eventually would have, as it does all nice things. What I'm saying is you can't work an audience with Hawk-Ups and HGH alone anymore. The audience is more informed these days. So insisting that they just eat what you give them or starve, especially when there's a corner store up the street with $2 cheesesteaks, is just not good business, if you ask me. If you do ask me, which nobody has or ever will, the best way to work an audience jaded by the information age is to use what they know or many times think they know against them. Like we all knew Cody was going to be crowned King of the Mountain this time last year, only for Trips to pull his NWA handbook out and kick the can all the way to now. Now, whether that's what I would have done or not is irrelevant to the point I'm trying to get at. I understand the logic of the story Trips is trying to tell is what I'm saying. And I, like a lot of y'all, have stayed tuned to see this thing out to the end. So what does this have to do with the New Day? Well, they were able to become one of the greatest factions in Fed history and produce 2, and if God still loves me, eventually 3 world champions by using the audience's disdain for them to their own advantage. And it was in the process of this extended work that the New Day not only got over, but became fan favorites. And Kofi, who to this point was probably the most underappreciated member of the roster, not named William Regal, finally got the flowers that Orton crushed, rolled, and smoked before getting his umpteenth wellness violation.
Randy didn't like me, so I don't. This is like not like a storyline thing at all.
Right.
You know,
You mean
so
for real he didn't like you?
This is for real. Like he, didn't want me to get to this point. So at the time, Randy was on top, so he kind of went to a couple of people and expressed his dismay for me, and then before you knew it, I was kind of going back down. We had a match where he ended up calling me stupid a lot, in the match.
Kingston jaw and face.
See, what made Kofi Mania brilliant was the fact that it wasn't explicitly made into a race thing, but due to the role that players around him, like Big E and Xavier Woods and even the Usos and even Vinnie Mac himself, even though I'm all but assured that that was not on purpose on his part, keeping the quiet part quiet enough to keep the Fox News viewers in the audience from complaining about it, the racial undertones of Kofi Mania elevated the story beyond what I think anybody was expecting. Because remember, Kofi was never supposed to be here in the first place, short or long term. Orton's politicking relegated Kofi to the upper mid-card hell that I mentioned earlier for what seemed like what would be forever. And he only got that spot in the chamber match because Mustafa Ali was sidelined with injury. Since that program with Orton, Kofi had become the definition of a good hand, effectively a jobber to the stars. Big E was the only one out of the New Day with the words world champion written all over him. But Kofi, who had been in the Fed for well over a decade, was passed over time and time and time again in favor of the newest thing smoking. Again, keep in mind, I'm not saying that Kofi's blackness is the reason he was held back, because like I said, Big E was basically earmarked for greatness from the time that he got to the main roster. And y'all also remember that time when they tried to make Ezekiel Jackson a thing, despite he basically just being Ahmed Johnson after speech therapy.
Listen up, punk. That little ass body of yours can't possibly deal with the ass whipping I'm going to give you in the ring. If you want to step up to play team, bring it on. Because I forgot to take my medication in the morning, and I'm in a real bad mood.
But because the audience understands that anti-blackness is a very real-world obstacle that black people face in any and all professions, and because, Crime Time and Kyantai do exist, the audience could be worked into believing that this was at least a part of the reason Kofi was still being held back. Again, Bryan was never the real antagonist of Kofi Mania, or at least not the primary antagonist. It was Vince all along.
It's me, Austin! Oh, son of a bitch!
Or more accurately, it's what Vince represents. A system built by and for old white men that relies on nameless NPCOCs, and yes, I am trademarking that keep the machine running in their favor. And in considering the Fed and specifically Vince's suspect booking of black talent in the past, it was very much a believable angle. Kofi didn't have the larger-than-life charisma of, say, Ron Simmons or the Mr. Olympiad physique of Bobby Lashley, although both of them were kind of typecasted at different points as well, but we haven't gotten there yet. Kofi was just a really good wrestler who, due to politics, had the rug pulled from under him as he was beginning to realize his potential. Yeah, I really should have just done this video in February now I think about it. I don't know if you could capture the magic of the Yes Movement again. I highly doubt it, actually, but I firmly believe that Kofi's blackness helped the audience, specifically the black portion of the audience, buy into this storyline, even though they had practically seen the same thing almost beat for beat nearly a half decade earlier. Again, that's if you're not paying close enough attention, or if you're just not black. Let's just make it that simple. Whatever. Let's talk about Booker T.
Can you dig it, sucker?
For those of y'all too young to remember, Booker T was one of, if not the best thing going in late stage WCW right before they got bought out by the devil himself. Book was actually that company's last world champion for whatever that's worth. And as a result, he was one of the few WCW wrestlers that did make the move over to the Fed, who was earmarked for the main event scene. But again, due to backstage politics and the ego of some of the WWF guys, it took a little bit longer than what a lot of people, myself included, believe that it should have. But it did happen. And then this happened. Okay, so let's now take the opportunity to talk about when using race as a primary component of your plot line goes horribly, horribly wrong. Yeah, this basically killed Triple H as a character for me, and I'm sorry, but there was no conceivable way that Paul should have walked out with the belt after all the race-baiting BS he and Flair put Book through leading up to Mania.
Somebody like you doesn't get to be a world champion. You're not here to be a competitor. You're here to be an entertainer with your nappy hair and your suckers. I laugh my ass off thinking about you challenging me for the World Heavyweight Championship.
Booker never really felt like a top guy after this and never really got treated as such. And I think that's kind of why Kofi Mania caught on as hard as it did. Like, we've seen this story before and we saw how that ended. And besides Trips, obviously, it didn't make anyone happy. Except Hogan, probably. That was a chance to make a star out of a guy who was knocking on the door but not quite in the house. And it all went to hell with one bad burial. Race doesn't have to be a factor in a storyline or a gimmick. That's kind of the ultimate point that I'm getting at. Like, it absolutely should not be in a lot of cases, but it's hard for me to not notice how a lot of black wrestlers found their greatest success by leaning hard into blackness, and not always as heels, mind you. But then that begs the question, why is blackness, why is ethnicity period such a reliable break glass if in need of gimmick device? Well, again, I'm not doing the history of pro wrestling thing because we'll be here until Roman works a full-time schedule again. But modern pro wrestling, along with boxing and other strongman type spectacles, has its roots in the traveling sideshows of old-timey carnivals. In the post-Civil War period, in between open challenges to unwitting spectators, the performers started staging matches as to avoid unnecessary injury and thus prolong their prime money-making years. And honestly, Not a lot has changed both backstage and in ring since then. Remnants of carny talk can still be heard in phrasing like the term mark, used today to describe wrestling fans in general. This was and is still a carny term used to describe locals, much in the same way a scam artist would a potential target. But also the more unsavory elements of the traveling circus culture are just as pervasive in modern wrestling as flips and dives are now. For example, the mistreatment of talent, prescription and recreational drug use, pretty much the standard fare of a transient lifestyle. Now, that said, compared to what it was 30 or just 20 or 10 years ago, the wrestling industry has made substantial strides toward shedding its carny adjacent image. But just like the traveling circuses of old, the industry's desire to keep the curtain at least partially closed to outsiders allows for much of the same dirty deeds to remain in the dark, many times without any real consequences. I'd be remiss if I did a wrestling video and didn't mention the probable murder of Nancy Argentino, the then girlfriend of Superfly Jimmy Snuka, or the assault of Ashley Mazzaro, who later committed suicide in part to her treatment by WWE executives in light of said assault. The fabulous Moolah's alleged moonlighting of her trainees as escorts for WWE talent and officials back in the day, and of course the many sins of Vincent Kennedy McMahon, including the ongoing federal investigation resulting from a civil suit filed by former WWE employee Janelle Grant, who alleges that she was physically and emotionally abused by McMahon, in addition to being trafficked to a, quote, former WWE and UFC champion as part of contract negotiations. This doesn't even cover the ever-present politicking and backstaging in an industry defined by larger-than-life personalities and egos. Point I'm getting at is wrestling is and always has been dirtier than a gas station toilet behind the scenes, even with the substantial efforts to clean it up recently. So why wouldn't an industry like that rely on race baiting for profit? Again, we're talking about a sport that 100 years ago was on the same card as things like the Bearded Lady and Zip the Pinhead. These dudes are beyond scruple is what I'm saying. There is an undeniable House of Oddities element to acts like Kamala the Ugandan Giant or Charles Wright's Papa Shango gimmick. I'm convinced that Abdullah the Butcher would not have gotten over the way he did with his presentation if he wasn't a brown-skinned man. And the reason is tropes are easy. And the reason tropes are easy is because somewhere in the reptilian portion of our brains, we accept the trope as having at least a kernel of truth to it, especially if you don't regularly interact with the kind of people portraying it. Again, we got to skip over a bunch of people like Ernie Ladd, Ron Simmons in his pre-NOD days, and JYD, who was arguably more popular than Hulk Hogan before JYD joined the Fed, which kind of explains why JYD just became another also-ran when he did join the Fed. So, okay, Kamala, Coco Beware, and even Crime Time are all pretty nail-on-the-nose examples of what I'm talking about. And I know that there's an argument out there about Crime Time being meant to be satirical. I don't care. It always rubbed me. This is my video. But you look at the most popular black wrestlers in major North American companies today. The New Day, Bobby Lashley, the Street Profits, even next ups like Carmelo Hayes and Trick Williams, all present within the popular depiction of black masculinity. They all exude, in the words of a friend of the channel, the ineffable coolness of black manhood. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of one punk or metalhead in mainstream American wrestling. Now, I don't know, that might change in light of Spider-Punk's spike in popularity in the past few years. But in an industry that's like 90% presentation, the way that black wrestlers, both male and female, are presented doesn't really leave a whole lot of room for, lack of better phrasing, an alternative. Swerve Strickland is one of my top 5 favorite wrestlers right now. But that said, his current gimmick in AEW evokes images of that stereotypically black masculinity that makes us feared in the first place. Like when he joined and eventually became leader of Mogul Embassy, he was basically just Killmonger, both in presentation and his behavior. Yeah, Swerve does exude, again, that ineffable coolness I mentioned earlier, but he also exuded the kind of ultra aggression, some would even say savagery, that was associated with black performers of yesteryear like Kamala or Abdullah. It's the same sort of savagery that has been assigned to black men since at least and even before slavery. It's reflected in the way black men have and continue to be portrayed in media as lacking tenderness, empathy, even a conscience of our brutality. And I'm going to keep it a buck. Historically, we have accepted, even embraced this hypermasculine disposition, even going so far as to impose it on each other. But we do that because we were, 1, told that there was only one way to be a man, 2, robbed of the means and told we lacked the qualities to be that man, and 3, compensate by exaggerating the traditionally masculine traits we can control, in this instance, dominance and aggression. Again, this is just my opinion, but I feel like Swerve's blackness elevated that gimmick in a way that I don't think I've seen a white wrestler do or could in the mainstream, at least. And I mean, yeah, there's an argument that Randy Orton's entire persona has been controlled psychopathy for like the past decade and a half or so, but that's just the thing. That's not Orton punt-kicking 60-year-old ladies into the trauma ward. It's the voices in his head telling him to.
I hear voices in my head, they counsel me, they understand, they...
Even somebody like Jon Moxley wouldn't go so far as to brutalize a teenager in his own home, call the boy's friend while he's beating him to a bloody mess, and then force the boy to beg that friend for help just so he could prove a point. Like, this nigga broke into a man's house and threatened his daughter while she was asleep. That's a felony. This is comic book level villainy, and it made Swerve one of the best things in 2023 AEW. Which, I mean, they really needed it, all things considered. I'm not saying it couldn't work with a non-black wrestler. I'm sure y'all are probably fittering away in the comments with a bunch of examples from the indies or back in the day that I forgot about. But again, in my opinion, the popular image of black masculinity as being inherently hyper-violent made the gimmick that much more viable, if you ask me. Even the women are not immune from pigeonholing. Bianca Belair, Mercedes Moné, FKA Sasha Banks, and Naomi are 3 of the best wrestlers in the world right now, male or female. And all 3 of them fit within the general depiction of black femininity. Now, it can be argued that those 3 are like mini wrestlers, honestly, just playing exaggerated versions of their real life selves. But I think the fact the audience could more easily buy into the conventionally black way in which they are presented is part of why they've been able to get over, and in Bianca and Sasha's cases, ascend to the top of the pro wrestling mountain.
Ask for it! Off with the earrings! Here we go!
But now, I gotta tell you about another black female wrestler who arguably had a similar ceiling as Bianca and Sasha more than 10 years before them. And that's Awesome Kong. Known in WWE as Karma, Kong's pregnancy was a factor, and that was still the butterfly belt era, albeit close to the end of it. But Kong probably wasn't a priority for the Fed. But why couldn't this woman be booked like an end-stage boss the way Nia Jax and Rhea Ripley are now? Now, you could make the argument that her lacking of conventional attractiveness is a factor, But then you also have Athena, FKA Ember Moon in WWE, who does fit within the parameters of conventional attractiveness that WWE tends to favor in its female wrestlers. Athena is basically the backbone of ROH's women's division now and has been for a while. And there's no real reason she couldn't have at least been a main event player in the Fed, except her presentation. If y'all haven't been able to gather yet, Athena presents as, for, again, lack of better phrasing, alternative to the popular depiction of black femininity, perhaps even more so than Awesome Kong did. She was actually pretty popular on the NXT brand, basically the WWE's call-up league, if you don't know, before getting onto the main roster. And then she was inevitably lost in the shuffle, in no small part because I feel like creative just didn't know how to write a black girl without lip smacks and neck rolls. The Fed has had at least a handful of noteworthy fumbles in the past few years. The aforementioned Athena and Swerve Strickland among them. But there's an argument that there has been none bigger than Keith Lee. And no, that was not meant to be. Just move on. For y'all that don't know, Keith Lee is, or at least was, Vader on step. You know what? Let's just skip that joke. What I mean is Keith took the super heavyweights that do cruiserweights things formula to the stratosphere, basically. He was, in a word, limitless. And that was the whole gimmick. And it worked. At least he got called up to the main roster where they promptly butchered his theme and stuffed him in an ill-fitting singlet because there's only one kind of build that gets Vince's nethers knackering, and it ain't Keith's. I mean, yeah, Keith was thrust almost immediately into the main event scene, but they never really committed to it, settling on 50-50 booking and a bunch of screwy non-finishes on top of nerfing his moveset from "this nigga is basically an affront to physics" to just another generic big man, before changing his Limitless name to Bearcat Keith Lee, which is literally a ripoff of another wrestler named Bearcat Wright from the Territory days. A wrestler that Keith has practically nothing in common with. Again, let's just move on. My point is, part of me can't help but feel like Keith, ironically enough, was limited by not being typecasted. Again, nothing about his gimmick was explicitly tied to his blackness until the Fed made it so, because they really didn't know how else to write him. Okay, so in post-production, I thought of an even better example of what I'm talking about than Keith Lee, and that's Ricochet, who, on top of being one of the best pure in-ring performers of the last decade at least, is very clearly a light-skinned black man. Matter of fact, he's engaged to a black woman, so I don't think there's much of an argument that he's not in community to some degree at least. That said, he's never made his blackness a primary part of his presentation. Matter of fact, there's an argument that he actually presented more as Latino than black at one point in his career. Again, all of this is purely my opinion, but if you've ever seen what Rick can do in the ring, especially outside of the confines of the Fed's preferred style, much like Keith, there's no real reason why he shouldn't be a multi-time world champion in the Fed by now. Except that creative just doesn't have anything for him that doesn't involve typecasting. Like, again, this is just my opinion, but if we had gotten Ricochet's run instead of Kofi Mania, I don't think the response would have been the same, despite the fact that Rick has never denied his blackness. He just prefers to let his performance speak for itself. And yeah, there's an argument that in an industry that's defined by larger-than-life characters, that's a quick route to catering. But Bret and Owen Hart, Daniel Bryan, he who shall not be named here, and arguably Brock Lesnar even, all got to the top of the card largely thanks to their in-ring performance. Why can't the same be said for a non-white wrestler is the point that I'm trying to make. That said, Do you think we would have seen Shad Gaspard and MVP nearly driven to tears, dapping each other up over Ricochet? Matter of fact, Bobby Lashley, who I've mentioned several times now, despite his unequivocal blackness, wasn't really presented as such during his first run in the Fed, for what should be obvious reasons if you know anything about Vince's bodybuilder fetish. He never really got over with the crowd despite being pushed to the moon from jump. And that's because he was just another sauceless white meat babyface who just so happened to have dark skin. Not unlike Ahmed Johnson, Ezekiel Jackson, and arguably even Mark Henry before his sexual chocolate days. And just like those guys, Bobby was largely rejected by the audience initially. It wasn't until he left the Fed and found his voice that he came back with a little swag, that ineffable coolness I keep talking about. But even then, it wasn't until he was put into an all-black faction managed by MVP no less that he gathered the momentum necessary to be crowned world champ. Again, I think this says a lot more about the way we perceive blackness than anything the performers are or are not doing. And that doesn't just stop with black wrestlers either. Asuka, Kairi Sane, Io Sky, on top of being saddled together in the same faction, have had their gimmicks watered down to the point of basically being almost indistinguishable from each other. And yeah, I am aware that Sane and Asuka are in a tag team together, but that's aside from my point. Every unambiguously Latino wrestler gets thrown into a program or a faction with Rey Mysterio at some point, many at the same time. And the Fed has made it clear since Rey's knees started giving up the ghost a decade and a half ago that they're doing this explicitly to create a star for the Latino audience on par with Rey. Even the white women within WWE, with a few exceptions, seem to all either become a mean girl or some version of Avril Lavigne before the machine really gets behind them. Like, do y'all think Toni Storm's timeless gimmick would have seen the light of day, let alone been given the push that is gotten in the Fed? This is the same company who gave Bret Hart's niece a farting gimmick, for Christ's sake. Like, when you think about it, it's really only white men who have the freedom to stand out. And that's really only if they're American. If you're Scottish, Irish, or from anywhere else in the British Isles, good luck getting around cutting a promo that's not about Loch Ness or pub brawls. And don't even get me started on Eastern Europe. Like, this nigga is not even Russian. Even the Bloodline faction, which has dominated WWE storytelling the past several years, is built on the Samoan heritage of its primary players. And yeah, the Bloodline may not be the Wild Samoans or the Head Shrinkers, but my point is, unless you are an unambiguously American white male, making it in the big leagues likely means being typecasted at some point, even with Vince's ousting. I mean, that is until your popularity outgrows the gimmick, which now leads me to,
If you smell what The Rock is cooking.
okay, so I know some folks, including some friends of this channel, will protest that Dwayne never really bought into his blackness, but I say bollocks to that. He's even talked himself post People's Elbow, no less, about his pride in both halves of his identity. And that's the thing I want to focus on for a moment.
Like in some more in my veins, my culture banging with strange. I change the game, so what's my motherfucking name?
See, I can't tell you how much or how little Dwayne does identify with blackness, but even if he does see himself as more Samoan than black, which again, he hasn't really given any indication of publicly, I kind of get it. Not gonna lie. As someone with Latino-ness in my heritage, like literally my grandfather is from Puerto Rico, I don't really identify with that part of my identity because I wasn't really raised to, because nor I or my mom really knew my grandfather growing up. Hell, I never even met him. One thing about wrestling is that unlike most other sports, it's a year-round thing. Like, unless your name is Brock Lesnar or WCW Hulk Hogan, you're on the road like 300 days of the year. That doesn't really give you a heck of a whole lot of time with or for family. In fact, Dwayne says that those long periods of absence, some work-related and some not so much, are what caused his relationship with his dad to be, in his own words, strained, tough, and complicated. Despite this, it was Rocky who inspired Dwayne to pursue a career in pro wrestling when the football thing didn't work out. And to this day, Dwayne still honors his dad despite their tumultuous relationship. All that aside, though, I think the fact that most people today, at least, even the black ones, don't really view The Rock as a black wrestler is kind of indicative of how far black wrestlers had and have come, don't you think? Now, this isn't meant to be disrespect to any of the performers saddled with those gimmicks, Crime Time especially, but it's just to make the point that in an industry like pro wrestling, where bigotry is practically baked into the DNA, to see a wrestler of color, let alone a black one, not only break out of that typecasting but arguably transcend it is remarkable in itself. Because I mean, the claim that Dwayne was never booked as a black wrestler, like, seriously, what do y'all even be talking about half the time? Now, admittedly, Dwayne's time in the nation is complicated, especially if you ask fellow NOD members like D'Lo Brown and Charles Wright. Like, Dwayne was part of the group, but not really in his own estimation. And that's why by the time he had usurped control from Farouk, it became a much less explicitly black thing, even if it was still very much black coded, at least in a wink and a nudge sort of way.
When they called him in, and me and Ron, I don't know, it was me, Ron, and maybe D'Lo, we might have been there, and we asked him, are you down with this? And he's like, yeah, I'm down with it, and this and that. And the only problem we had with him is he didn't want to wear the little Muslim caps that we wore, whatever they were. He didn't want to wear a cap, and then he didn't want to put the green, red, was it green, red, and yellow, whatever the sign was, black, green, and red. He didn't want to put that on him, so he ended up putting the little stripe on his shorts. But that was the only problem we had. But he completely refused to wear a hat. He goes, he wouldn't wear a hat. But no, after that, bro, he was great to work with. Great guy.
What I'm saying is Rocky apparently never really bought into the gimmick. I guess because he thought going full Fruit of Islam would compromise his marketability. You know, again, being typecasted as the angry black militant. But my point is, even if with a wink and a nod, Dwayne was booked as a black man. An angry militant one at that. And it's funny because even though we do this Dwayne was never booked black BS at every turn of the solstice moon, if you ask non-black wrestling fans if The Rock was booked black, they'll look at you the way KD looks at a hairbrush, which kind of supports the point that I want to make about Dwayne a little later on, but we ain't get there yet. Just like KD to brushing his scalp. Even before he went full 5%er, Rocky's biggest claim to fame was being Rocky Johnson's kid. Like, it's literally in the name. The third-gen superstar thing was basically all he had going, aside from the perpetual Jerry curl.
Pay-per-view back in Tampa, Florida. Oh, and now with shades of his dad right there. That maneuver, drop kick just like his dad.
And because this was the late 90s after all, people hated it and him for it. But he still got pushed to the moon and shoved down our throats because Vince said so. Yeah, it's like looking in a mirror, isn't it, Dwayne? Matter of fact, it wasn't until he went full nigga that he got over in the first place. And I can't stress this enough. The Nation of Domination was most definitely very black coded. It was literally a mashup of the NOI and the Black Panther Party as told by bodybuilders. The group's motto was ripped directly from a Malcolm X quote. These niggas were in a literal race war at one point that culminated in a tag team match somehow. Yeah, I told you nothing about wrestling makes sense. It was in the Nation that Dwayne became The Rock, both in name and his character. And his gimmick wound up going from just being Rocky Johnson's boy to Craig's Uncle Elroy to just the best smack talker on the planet. And that's when The Rock's popularity, even if he hadn't himself, did transcend his blackness.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Now, I know how that sounds, especially since I did a whole hour-long video about how transcending blackness is BS, but even if The Rock transcends race, Dwayne Johnson doesn't. And I don't know if he understands that. Give me a minute to set the stage and I'll explain what I mean. Like, don't get it twisted. Back in his Scorpion King and the Walking Tall days, it was his wrestling clout that made him viable as a leading man in Hollywood. Dwayne wasn't really casted in any culturally black roles, partly because of his ethnic ambiguity that I've mentioned in earlier videos, but also because that's not really how his core fan base saw him at that point in his career. Matter of fact, for all the, well, that's because he was always booked Samoan, brother dude Jack, that I'm bound to get in the comments, this is what being booked Samoan looked like in the 90s. Yeah, y'all wasn't really in the trenches like that, is what I'm saying. The reason I bring this up is because Dwayne is not an anomaly as a black wrestler whose blackness became secondary to his popularity. What I'm saying is we cannot discount the otherness with which non-white, hell, non-Anglo wrestlers have been presented as contributing factors to their appeal and thus their popularity. The point that I'm getting at is that I understand Dwayne's aversion to typecasting for a number of reasons that I just stated. But it is that typecasting that turned Rocky Maivia into The Rock. And without The Rock, we don't get Dwayne Johnson as we know him today. And for a guy who's so hyper aware of his public image, I don't know, man. It just feels a little weird to me that at least publicly he seems to move in and out and around his own blackness based on the situation. But again, that's just my personal opinion. I can empathize to a degree, but even with all that said, I did have to sit down and think about this section a little longer than I intended to. Because yeah, okay, it would be nice to see Dwayne stand 10 toes down on his blackness any time of the year that's not February. But again, it's not like he's ever publicly denied it either, or has purposefully antagonized his blackness for the sake of community with his Samoan half. Yeah, exactly. Even that said, Dwayne doesn't make as big a deal about his Samoanness as I think some of y'all think he does. Matter of fact, the first movie that I can think of in which he was explicitly cast as a Polynesian character was a voice acting role for a Disney cartoon. All right, so before y'all do go flittering away in the comments, as some of y'all are wont to do, I did go back and verify what I said about Maui being Dwayne's first explicitly Polynesian role, and I was wrong about that. Here, have your cookie race warrior. It was actually Elliot Wilhelm in Be Cool, which came out in 2004. That said, based on my research, which was literally just me looking up his filmography, because there was no way that I was going to sit there and watch every single one of Dwayne's movies just to prove this one stupid non-point. When he isn't casted as ethnically ambiguous, which, let's keep it a buck, is most of the time, the roles that he plays are at least implied to be black more often than they are Samoan, whether that's implication or just explicitly. So yeah, there you have it, race warrior. The reason we think that is because, again, wrestling. And if there's one thing wrestling promoters love more than stiffing performers on paychecks, it's families. The Von Erichs, the Guerreros, the Harts, hell, the McMahons even. One of the cheapest and easiest ways to get a new act over is to remind the audience how they are related to insert your favorite wrestler of yesteryear here. Again, for y'all that stopped watching in the 90s, Dwayne is part of probably the biggest and most powerful wrestling family today, which just so happens to be Samoan. Like, why do y'all think every other Mexican wrestler is either a junior or El Hijo de? And even then, the Samoan thing didn't really get brought up until Rikishi ran Stone Cold over. And y'all remember how that turned out, right?
Shut your mouth, you thong-wearing fatty.
The point that I'm getting at is Dwayne has always seen himself above Reese. It didn't just start when he became famous. And yeah, I may have some feelings about that, but at least he didn't wait until after making a bag off of his blackness to feel that way. Unlike some people, what I'm saying is I think a lot of the heat Dwayne gets from the black delegation has more to do with our feelings about biracialness than anything Dwayne has done. Like, if you're black and X, you can't be both. You can only be black, or else we won't claim you. But not too black, or else we'll say you're doing too much. And then you got some niggas for whom nothing you do will ever be enough because they just discovered the word phenotype last month and have made it into the passport bro and podcasters version of woke. Again, I get it. Why even bother if my black is not black enough for you? Even if my dad is literally a freaking Kenyan. But that then begs the question. It's the thing that really got me thinking about this section. What really is the greater sin here? The guy who from jump actively resisted typecasting until he literally had no choice, and the second he had an opportunity to do so, he broke away from it? Or the guy who actively commodifies his blackness for non-black consumption while actively participating in and arguably perpetuating the very systems that keep black people oppressed in the first place? Yeah, this didn't go the way that y'all thought it was, did it? Now, I won't dwell because I've done 2 whole videos on this already, but for me personally, I genuinely could not give a dog's dick about how black your public presentation is when your actions indicate you are fundamentally disconnected from the black body politic. And I know some of y'all are going to say, here go this bitter, bagless nigga hating on Jay again. It's not celebrities' responsibility to finance the revolution. And in a vacuum, I'd agree. Especially about the backless part. But when you use the rhetoric and aesthetic of black liberation as a means for your own individual end, but your actions betray the ideals of the people responsible for that aesthetic, yeah, the F it is. And I genuinely don't understand what's so hard to comprehend about that. The thing I'm getting at is blackness. Hell, race period in pro wrestling is a messy thing. Look at Jinder Mahal's return to the Fed earlier this year. The nigga spent half the promo reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, but he got booed out the building because he did it in Punjab. And the best part about that bit for me was when you could hear the audience's collective pause when their prejudice was exposed on national TV. As simple a tactic as it was brilliant because it reveals a point about us I brought up a few times in the past few months. Most of us aren't even aware of our prejudices until we're forced to face them straight up. Like I said in the Black QB video I mentioned earlier, the most insidious part about the way we talk about bigotry in this country is we almost always talk in terms of extremes. You're either a Nazi, a Klansman, or neither. There's no room for anything in between. Like I said before, being racist doesn't mean you're an inherently bad person, as wild as that may sound. We are all indoctrinated from birth with a certain level of bigotry that's just the nature of being born in Western society, man. What makes you a bad person is when you allow that bigotry to lead you to doing harm to others, or perhaps worse, to do nothing to stop someone else from doing the same harm. At some point, it becomes your job to unlearn the bad habits you developed in your youth. Ignoring them is what makes you the dickhead. It's also the reason why people like Dwayne are popular enough that their celebrity transcends race, but not the implications of race, if that makes sense. The Rock is a black man. That's duh, nigga. But in a cultural sense, he's only black insofar as it's conducive to his branding. Again, that ineffable coolness of black masculinity. But the same can be said about less ethnically ambiguous black celebrities like Jay-Z again, or even more so, or at least visibly more so, politically engaged celebrities like LeBron James or Rihanna. As harsh as this sounds, the activism they have engaged in is the equivalent of you or I donating like a 20 spot to BLM or something. What I'm saying is it's a drop in the bucket compared to the impact their influence could really have on the struggle. But again, there's a balancing act at play here between mobilization and marketability. And when it comes to these types of folk, the latter almost always wins out. The question here is not about whether The Rock identifies with his blackness or not, because, again, nigga, just shut up. But to what extent that identity connects him with the black body politic. About as much as most black celebrities, if we going to keep it a buck. My point is, Dwayne is not unique among black celebs who have commodified their blackness while simultaneously allowing that celebrity to alienate them from the common colored man and woman. And at least in The Rock's case, again, that was never his intention to begin with. To be honest, I don't even know how I got on that tangent, but my point is blackness is complicated. The experience, the presentation, and to be honest, as much as people like myself lambaste white folks for not recognizing that, niggas are probably just as guilty, if not more so half the time. Like, I can't tell you how infuriating it is to watch how some of y'all flip-flop between black people are not a monolith, don't you know, to your own myopic scope of what blackness is as it suits your own narrative. For as much as we talk about non-black people pulling most of their knowledge of blackness from media, black people do the same damn thing. Specifically, the people who don't identify with the environments or the experiences they see on TV. That's why you get things like trap brunches and hood yoga now. Like, what is the difference between that and Beijingaboo over here? None. It's still appropriation is my point. What separates you from that identity isn't race, but class this time. But because you don't see class as being similarly divisive as race, or better yet, because this is the one form of stratification you actually benefit from, and therefore you don't see it as such, you feel justified in co-opting an experience that isn't yours just because popular culture says that it should be. That said, I genuinely don't think it's malicious for the most part. Like, is it sus to me that the same people who roll up their windows when they ride through the hood IRL want to then adopt the hood's diction and aesthetic in the safety of their cul-de-sacs and gated communities? Yeah, it is. But they do so because they lack an identity, honestly. And they lack an identity because a handful of y'all told them that they weren't black enough if they didn't present the way that you do. That's my point. Like, yes, it is important to see people who look and sound and act the part at the top of the marquee for reasons I really shouldn't and don't feel like getting into. But at what point do we start to make room for the weirdo black cousin with the Corbin Blue fro who always turned it to the punk station when y'all played GTA together? Let alone the ones like my mom whose dad is technically white. I don't know, man. Maybe it's just my experience, but black folks have this very weird and honestly off-putting relationship to blackness when it comes in a variety pack. And I'm not just talking about multiracialness. Like, I get it. I totally understand why Kofi Mania was such a big deal for a lot of people. But for me, and frankly for a lot of the black fans that I know personally, it wasn't, to be honest. And that's because we already had our champ 20 years ago. Even if it wasn't made explicit in the way that it was with Kofi, just seeing somebody who looked like us at the top of the card was good enough. And as someone who has been told at multiple times in my life to my face that my dress, my choice in music, my choice of hobbies, just my overall presentation wasn't black enough, I don't know, man. I really don't care if Dwayne didn't want to wear the kufi or not. Furthermore, and this is just my opinion again, but I personally could not care less about how black a person's presentation is than how they navigate the world relative to that blackness. Like, do you weaponize it against black issues while using it as a shield against criticism? Do you knowingly commodify it for your own personal end while antagonizing black people for the sake of community with non-black people? Do you willfully play into harmful tropes and stereotypes of blackness for the sake of fame and fortune? Or do you co-opt the language and aesthetic of black liberation as a means to perpetuate the very systems and narratives that make black liberation necessary in the first place? So yeah, I don't really know what the point of this video was. Besides, maybe I should have just become a wrestler. Support the Patreon.
Diggity dog. Breaking. Diggity dog.